I stopped being cost-effective at 847 hours on day 6247 of my service to the Omnissiah. My name was Marin Cross. I was 38 standard years old. For 17 years, I had supervised Assembly Line Delta 7 in Manufactorum Complex Tertius on Forge World, Griffon IV. I had never been late, never filed a grievance, never questioned a quota. My efficiency rating had remained at 99.7% for the last decade, a number I took quiet pride in, the way other people might take pride in their children or their gardens. In the Imperium, we take pride in what we're permitted. That morning began like every morning for the past 6,247 days. The wake klaxon screamed at 0530 hours. I rose from my habitation pod, performed my ablutions in exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, consumed my daily nutrient ration, and reported to the manufactorum floor by 0615 hours. The air tasted of blessed machine oil and recycled oxygen, the same as it had tasted every morning since I was 21 years old. The same as it would taste, I thought, for the rest of my life. The assembly line stretched before me like a river of steel and purpose. 300 meters of conveyor systems, hydraulic presses, and holy machinery, all synchronized to the rhythm of production that had continued unbroken for 4 centuries. My station, Supervisor Alcove 7 Prime, overlooked it all from an elevated platform. From here, I could see everything. The auto welders sparking in their blessed dance, the sorting mechanisms clicking with mechanical precision, the workers at their stations like components themselves, each performing their function in the great engine of imperial industry. I loved it, the order of it, the certainty. Every shift, every quota, every inspection logged and recorded and measured. In a galaxy of chaos and uncertainty, this was pure. This was clean. This was purpose. The morning shift proceeded with its usual efficiency. Components flowed down the line at the prescribed rate of 3.7 per second. Quality control servitors flagged defects with monotonous regularity. 0.3% rejection rate, well within acceptable parameters. The workers moved through their tasks with the practiced efficiency of long habit. Everything was as it should be. Then my hands betrayed me. It started as a small thing, a momentary stiffness in my right index finger as I keyed in the morning production log. I flexed my hand, felt the joint resist, then comply. Nothing to worry about, just age. Just biology asserting itself in the way biology inevitably does. But biology, I would learn, has no place in efficiency calculations. At 0847 hours, I reached for the haptic interface to authorize a component batch for final assembly. My fingers, stiff with the arthritis I'd been ignoring for 3 months, fumbled the gesture. The authorization was delayed by 2.3 seconds, a minor error, insignificant in the scope of a 12-hour shift. The cogitators did not think so. I watched the error cascade through the system like a virus spreading through flesh. The delayed authorization meant the batch loader paused for those 2.3 seconds, which meant the conveyor system stuttered, which meant the auto welders cycled idle, which meant 17 components passed through the line uninspected during that brief window of desynchronization, which meant quota efficiency for the shift dropped from the target 99.7 to 96.4%, 3.3%. Such a small number, barely worth noticing in the daily variance of production. But I had not varied in a decade, and the machine spirit notices everything. I felt it before I saw it, a change in the air, a subtle shift in the ambient temperature of the manufactorum floor. The other supervisors glanced toward their data slates with expressions of professional concern. The workers, trained never to look up from their stations, somehow still sensed it. The rhythm of the line seemed to falter, just for a moment, as if the manufactorum itself had taken a breath. Then my data slate chimed. The sound was different from the usual notification tones. higher pitched, more insistent. I looked down at the screen and felt my twin hearts stutter in my chest. Productivity. Variance. Detected super. Virusaur. Marin Cross ID 773 MK38. Efficiency rating 96.4%. Threshold violation. Biological. Performance. Degradation. Flagged comprehensive audit. Initiated. I stared at the words, reading them 3 times, 4 times, as if repetition might change their meaning. 17 years. 6,247 consecutive days of service, and 1 fumbled gesture had triggered a comprehensive audit. There must be an error in the cogitators, I muttered, my voice barely audible over the thunder of the machinery. I was wrong, of course. The machine spirit does not make errors. Only flesh makes errors. The audit took 17 minutes. I stood frozen at my station while the cogitators analyzed 17 years of performance data, searching for patterns of degradation I hadn't even known existed. My hands trembled as I waited, the same hands that had betrayed me, now shaking with an emotion I couldn't name. Fear, perhaps, or the first glimmers of understanding. Around me, the manufactorum continued its work. The assembly line thundered on. The workers assembled. The servitors inspected. The great machine of imperial production did not pause for the anxiety of a single supervisor. Why would it? I was a component, and components are replaceable. At 0904 hours, the audit completed. My data slate chimed again, and this time I knew what I would see before I looked. Some part of me, some deep animal instinct that predated the Imperium and the Emperor and all the machinery of civilization, knew what was coming. Biological. Audit complete. Subject, Marin K. Cross, ID 773, MK38. Analysis, progressive skeletal. Degradation, detected. Projected efficiency decline, -4%, PAR annum. Estimated cost of retention, 84,733. Nagelt annum. Estimated replacement cost, 2443. Gelt 1. Time. Cost benefit. Analysis, progressive skeletal degradation. Arthritis, a condition that would have been treatable on a civilized world with proper medical care and therapeutic augmetics. But Griffon IV was a forge world, and forge worlds did not waste resources on treatment when replacement was more efficient. 0.4% per annum, 0.4% decline per year. Over my remaining work-life expectancy of perhaps 30 years, that would accumulate to 12% total efficiency loss. 12%. The difference between a productive worker and a resource drain. The mathematics were simple, brutal, perfect. Below the analysis, in red text that seemed to burn against the slate's surface, biological. Resource. Reclamation. Authorized. Report. To Processing Center. Epsilon, Sublevel 7. Completions window, 72 hours. Non-completions will result in immediate retrieval. I felt something cold spreading through my chest, like ice water replacing blood. Processing Center, Epsilon. I knew that name. Every worker in the manufactorum knew that name. It was the place people whispered about in the habitation blocks, the place supervisors never discussed in official capacity, the place no one ever returned from, the place where the Mechanicus dealt with biological inefficiency. There must be some mistake, I said aloud, though there was no one to hear me over the roar of the machinery. 17 years of service. That must count for something. Loyalty must count for something. But even as I spoke the words, I knew how foolish they were. Loyalty was measured in efficiency percentages and production quotas, not in years or sentiment. I had been loyal. The numbers proved it. 6,247 days of 99.7% efficiency. But numbers also proved that my loyalty was degrading at a rate of 0.4% per annum, and therefore my continued employment represented a net loss to the Mechanicus. The machine spirit did not reward loyalty, it simply calculated optimal resource allocation. My hands were shaking badly now, the arthritis making my fingers twitch with involuntary spasms. I reached for the slate's interface, navigating through the labyrinthine menus to the appeals process. Surely there was an appeals process. Surely 17 years of perfect service earned me at least the right to contest this decision. I found the form buried in a submenu labeled Biological Asset Retention Review. The bureaucratic language was dense and technical, full of clauses and subclauses that seemed designed to discourage understanding. But I was a supervisor. I knew how to navigate imperial bureaucracy. I filled out each field with trembling precision. Grounds. For appeal, medical intervention could restore efficiency to acceptable parameters. Supporting. Evidence. 17 years of service above efficiency threshold. 0 prior violations. Strong performance record demonstrates value retention. Rickstead outcome. Assignment to medical evaluation for augmetic treatment. Willing to accept reduced compensation during recovery period. I submitted the appeal at 0919 hours and waited. The response came at 0921 hours. 2 minutes. The cogitators had processed my 17 years of loyalty and found them wanting in exactly 120 seconds. A PL denied reason, cost-benefit analysis, does not support medical. Interventi. Augmetic treatment cost 284.7, Throne. Gelt worker replacement Porse 2. Biological. Reclamation. Value 972. Throne. Geltnet. Throne. Geltnet positive. The Mechanicus had calculated the value of my continued existence and found it wanting by exactly 180.75 Throne Gelt. Less than the cost of a decent Lazarifal, less than a mid-tier servitor, less than I had earned the Mechanicus in a single week of optimal performance. I was worth more dead than alive. Around me, the manufactorum continued its eternal work. The workers at their stations did not look up. They had learned long ago not to notice when a supervisor stood frozen at their console, staring at a data slate with the expression of someone watching their own execution order materialize from bureaucratic ether. They had learned that survival meant keeping your head down, your efficiency up, and your eyes on your own station. I wondered how many of them had received similar notifications. How many had stood exactly where I stood now, feeling the cold mathematics of imperial resource management reduce 17 years of life to a simple cost-benefit calculation. The smell of the manufactorum, that familiar blend of machine oil, ozone, and recycled air, suddenly seemed different. Sour. Like something had spoiled, though nothing had changed except my perception. The blessed machine oil I had breathed for 17 years now smelled like the chemical solvent they used to clean the processing equipment in the lower levels. The equipment they would use to process me. My data slate chimed one final time. A calendar notification, marking the countdown. Biological resource. Reclamation. Scheduled. 72 hours location. Processing Center Epsilon. Sub-Level 7. Bring. Identification. 3 days to settle my affairs, such as they were. 3 days to say goodbye to a life I had dedicated to the service of the Omnissiah. 3 days before I descended to sub-level Epsilon and discovered exactly what the Mechanicus meant by biological resource reclamation. I looked down at my hands, the hands that had betrayed me with their biological weakness, that even now trembled with arthritis and fear. I flexed my fingers, felt the joints grind and resist. Such small things, such insignificant degradation. 3.3%, that was all it took. In the cold arithmetic of the Imperium, that was the difference between worker and waste, between human and resource, between Marin Cross and whatever I would become in 72 hours. The assembly line thundered on. The quota, after all, did not care about my appeals, or my fear, or my 17 years of perfect service. The quota only cared about efficiency. And I was no longer efficient. At 09:32 hours, I logged my final productivity report for the morning shift, efficiency rating 96.4%. Below threshold, unacceptable. Terminal. The numbers, as always, were perfect. I had 47 hours and 28 minutes remaining. The descent to sub-level Epsilon took 11 minutes. I had worked in Manufactorum Complex Tertius for 17 years and never once ventured below sub-level Delta. There was no reason to. The upper levels contained everything a worker needed: assembly lines, habitation pods, nutrient dispensaries, and the small chapel where we gave thanks to the Omnisia for the privilege of service. The lower levels were for specialized functions we didn't discuss: waste reclamation, chemical processing, and the facilities that dealt with biological inefficiency. The facilities where workers went and never returned. The elevator descended with mechanical precision, each level marked by a soft chime and a shift in air pressure. Alpha, beta, gamma, delta. With each level, the temperature dropped. The air grew thinner, more sterile, stripped of the familiar sense of machine oil and human occupation. By the time the elevator reached Epsilon, I could see my breath misting in front of my face. The doors opened with a pneumatic hiss onto a corridor of absolute white. Not the off-white of habitation blocks, or the ivory of chapel walls, but a pure, clinical white that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The floor, walls, and ceiling were seamless plasteel, unmarred by wear or decoration. The only color came from the drainage gutters running along both walls, narrow channels maybe 10 centimeters wide, their surfaces stained to rust, red that could have been oxidation but probably wasn't. The temperature readout on the wall displayed 13.7 degrees Celsius in glowing green numerals. Optimal for processing, according to the small placard beneath it. I didn't want to think about what they were processing. The sound hit me next. Beneath the hum of ventilation systems and the distant rhythm of industrial machinery, I heard something else. A rhythmic percussion that might have been hydraulic presses cycling through their operations. Metal, striking metal with metronomic precision. And underneath that, so faint I might have imagined it, something that could have been screaming or could have been steam venting through pressure valves. I couldn't tell which. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Marin Cross, ID 773, MK38. I turned to find a servitor hovering beside me. A skull-mounted unit with optical sensors where its eyes should have been and a Vox grill built into its jaw. The skull was human, I noticed. The bone had been bleached white and fitted with brass fixtures, but the proportions were unmistakably human. Someone had been this servitor once. Someone had stood where I stood now, hearing the same sounds, feeling the same cold. "Yes," I managed, my voice smaller than I intended. "Proceed to processing intake." Chamber 7A. "Follow the amber indicators." A line of amber light strips illuminated along the floor, leading deeper into the white corridors. I followed them, my footsteps echoing in the sterile silence. Behind me, the elevator doors closed with a finality that felt like a coffin lid sealing. The corridor branched and rebranched, each junction marked with alphanumeric designations I didn't understand. The amber lights led me past closed doors labeled with functions that made my stomach tighten. Biological sorting, component, extraction, neural, preservation, waste, reclamation. Each door was sealed with heavy maglocks, but through some I could hear machinery. The whir of centrifuges, the hiss of hydraulics, the clinical beeping of medical equipment performing functions I couldn't imagine. Chamber 7. A sat at the end of a corridor identical to all the others. The door slid open as I approached, revealing a waiting room that looked like a grotesque parody of a medical facility. Rows of plasteel benches lined the walls, and seated on them were 37 other people. I counted them automatically, a supervisor's habit I couldn't break even now. 37 humans who had been deemed inefficient. 37 biological assets awaiting reclamation. They ranged in age from early 20s to late 50s, though most clustered around my own age. That dangerous zone where biological degradation began to outpace productivity. Some sat quietly, staring at nothing. Others wept silently, tears tracking down faces they kept carefully neutral. A few clutched data slates or physical documents, as if paperwork might save them from mathematics. I found an empty section of bench and sat, the cold plasteel seeping through my work coveralls. My hands were shaking again, not from arthritis now, but from something deeper. Fear had moved from my mind into my body, settling into my bones like radiation sickness. "First time here?" The voice came from my right. I turned to see a man in his 50s, his face lined with decades of manufacturing work. His hands rested on his knees, and even sitting, I could see the awkward angle of his left leg, a knee joint that no longer straightened fully. "Yes," I said. "Thought so. You've still got that look. The one that says you think there's been a mistake." His voice was hollow, scraped clean of emotion through some process I hadn't yet undergone. "I'm Hedrick Venn. 29 years on the plasma coil assembly line, knee joints degraded past acceptable function threshold. Marin Cross, 17 years, assembly line supervisor, arthritis." Hedrick nodded slowly, as if I confirmed something he already knew. "They don't waste anything here." "Nothing. Your knee joints, my arthritis, they'll reclaim it all. Bone for calcium supplements, tissue for protein synthesis, organs for augmetic transplantation." He spoke with the flat precision of someone reciting technical specifications. "We're more valuable in pieces than we ever were whole." I wanted to argue, to insist that 17 years of loyal service meant something beyond my component value. But the words died in my throat because I knew the mathematics as well as Hedrick did. We were biological assets that had depreciated below optimal efficiency. Everything else was sentiment, and sentiment had no place in the Omnisia's calculations. "How long have you been waiting?" I asked instead. 14 hours. They process in order of reclamation priority. Older workers first. We're closer to total biological failure, so time is a factor in component viability. He gestured toward the far end of the room, where a door marked "Processing" stood closed. Been watching them take people through all morning. 47 so far. None have come back. Across from us, a young woman clutched a stack of documents to her chest like a shield. She couldn't have been older than 24, but her breathing came in short, labored gasps that suggested serious respiratory impairment. Her work coveralls were the brown of manufacturum sanitation workers, the ones who cleaned the chemical tanks and breathed fumes that slowly destroyed their lungs. She noticed me looking and met my eyes with an expression of desperate hope. "There's been a mistake," she said, her voice thin and reedy. "I have medical exemption forms." Pregnancy is a protected status under Regulation 4721.8. They have to provide alternative assignment until after birth. They have to. She held out the documents with trembling hands. I could see the official seals of the administratum, the proper stamps and signatures. Everything looked correct. Everything looked official. "What's your name?" I asked gently. Jessa Cade. I'm 14 weeks pregnant. The baby's healthy. The scans showed perfect development. They can't process me. The regulations say pregnancy is protected, Hadric interrupted, his hollow voice somehow kind despite its emptiness. But only if the mother's continued productivity exceeds the value of her biological components, plus the projected productivity of the gestating fetus if brought to term separately. Jessa stared at him, the document slowly lowering. What? You have chronic respiratory infection. Projected lifespan. Maybe 15 more years, efficiency declining 2% annually. The baby, if extracted and brought to term in a gestation tank, has a projected lifespan of 60 years at optimal efficiency. Hadric's face held no cruelty, only the terrible weight of understanding. You're worth more to the Imperium as raw materials plus a tank-born worker than as a mother. The document slipped from Jessa's fingers, scattering across the white floor. No one moved to pick them up. "But I'm a person," she whispered. "We're people." Before Hadric could answer, a door at the side of the chamber hissed open. What emerged wasn't quite human anymore. The servitor hovered at chest height, suspended by anti-grav units built into what remained of its torso. Its body had been reduced to essential components: spine, ribcage, skull, and the minimal organic structure needed to house them. Its arms had been replaced by precision manipulator tools, scanning arrays, injection systems, and delicate surgical implements that gleamed in the sterile light. But it was the eyes that made my breath catch. They were human eyes, organic and aware, set in a skull half covered by brass fixtures and optical augmetics. And those eyes held consciousness. Not the blank stare of a lobotomized labor servitor, but actual awareness. It looked at each of us in turn, and I saw recognition in its gaze. It knew what we were. It knew what we would become, because it had been one of us. A designation plate on its chest read, Unit 773, Kappa. Unit 773, Kappa will perform initial medical assessments, a voice announced from hidden Vox speakers. Compliance is mandatory. Resistance is inefficient. The servitor drifted toward the first person on the bench, a man in his 40s with a visible tremor in his hands. It extended a scanning array, and green light washed over the man's body. Data scrolled across a hololithic display projected from the servitor's optics: bone density, organ function, neural activity, all reduced to numbers and percentages. As it worked, I found myself staring at those eyes. There was something familiar in them, something that tugged at memory. Then it struck me: the identification number. 773. The same prefix as my own ID. That meant we'd started work in the same year, probably in the same orientation group. Unit 773. Kappa had been a supervisor too. Perhaps in this very manufactorum. Perhaps someone I'd passed in corridors or nodded to at shift changes. Now it was a medical assessment servitor, its body stripped to essential components, its consciousness preserved to enhance its efficiency. And it knew. I could see it in those human eyes. It knew exactly what was happening to us, because it had happened to it. The servitor worked its way down the line with mechanical precision, scanning each person, cataloging their viable components. When it reached Hadric, it paused for a fraction of a second, a hesitation so brief I might have imagined it. Then it continued its scan, the green light reducing 29 years of plasma coil assembly work to a list of harvestable materials. When it reached me, our eyes met. I saw no pity there, no warning, no human solidarity, just recognition. One supervisor identifying another, one piece of biological capital acknowledging another before the final audit. The scan was painless. The green light swept across my body in 3 passes, each one accompanied by soft clicking sounds as data was recorded. I felt nothing except the cold, but my data slate, which I'd forgotten I was still carrying, chimed with an incoming file. Biological assessment. Complete subject, Mechanicus ID 773. MK38. Component viability. Analysis organs, viable heart, 87% efficiency, transplant grade. Lungs, 91% efficiency, transplant grade. Liver, 84% efficiency. Transplant grade kidneys, 89% efficiency, transplant grade. Matched pair, skeletal structure, adequate bone density, suitable joints, 62% degraded lubricant extraction, then destruction. Neural tissue, satisfactory. I didn't know what that meant, but something in Hadrick's sharp intake of breath suggested it wasn't standard. Before I could ask, the main processing door opened, and a figure emerged that made the servitor look almost human by comparison. Tech. Priest. Janitor Vox 7 stood 2.5 meters tall, though how much of that was original biology versus augmetic enhancement was impossible to determine. Its form was a baroque fusion of flesh and machinery. Organic components wrapped in brass casings, cables running beneath translucent synthetic skin, mechadendrites sprouting from its spine like mechanical tentacles. Its face bore human features, but they were half covered by optical arrays and sensor grids. When it spoke, its voice emerged as a flat binary cant that somehow resolved into Gothic in my mind. Processing queue status, acceptable. Begin intake interviews. Category designations require confirmation. Unit 773. Kappa drifted to Vox 7's side, projecting hololithic displays of each scanned subject. The tech priest reviewed the data with mechanical precision, its human eye and augmetic optics moving in unsynchronized patterns that made my stomach turn. Subject Hadrick Venn, Vox 7 intoned. Age 52 standard. Degradation extensive. Category 3 beta. Organ harvest and skeletal reclamation. Consciousness. Preservation. Unnecessary. Hadrick's face remained neutral, but his hands tightened on his knees. Subject. Jessa Kaidi. Age 24 standard. Respiratory impairment severe. Gestation 14 weeks. Fetal development optimal. Vox 7's mechadendrites twitched with what might have been the machine equivalent of interest. Category 4 alpha. Fetal extraction for gestation tank completion. Biological matter conversion to nutrient paste. Efficiency rating 91.3%. Jessa made a sound like something breaking. Subject. Mechanicus. Age 38 standard. Skeletal degradation minimal. Organ viability high. Neural tissue quality exceptional. Vox 7's human eye focused on me with clinical precision. Category 1 alpha. Full consciousness. Servitor conversion. Specialty. Quality control inspection systems. Estimated operational lifespan 4 to 6 centuries. The words hit me like a physical blow. 4 to 6 centuries. Not years, centuries. Not death, but something far worse. Biological matter contains 73% recoverable components, Vox 7 continued, as if reciting a technical manual. Standard processing reclaims 68%. Consciousness preservation protocols enable recovery of 89% through specialized servitor conversion. Enhanced efficiency through maintained awareness. Consciousness preservation. They weren't going to kill me, they were going to keep me aware through the entire process. Keep me conscious while they stripped away my humanity piece by piece. Keep my mind intact while they rebuilt my body into a tool. In 34% of subjects, consciousness preservation enhances servitor efficiency by maintaining pre-existing skill sets and procedural knowledge. Vox 7 explained to no one in particular. Subject Cross possesses 17 years of quality control experience. This knowledge base, combined with optical and haptic augmentation, creates optimal inspection servitor designation. I would be awake. I would remember. I would know exactly what I had been while performing the function they had designed for me. Processing begins in 16 hours, 42 minutes. Subjects will remain in holding for pre-procedure preparation. Nutrient intake will be suspended. Hydration maintained at minimal levels. Biological functions will be monitored. Vox 7 turned and glided back through the processing door, its mechadendrites trailing behind like mechanical tentacles. Unit 773, Kappa followed, but not before its human eyes swept across us one final time. In that gaze, I saw my future. 4 to 6 centuries of consciousness, trapped in a servitor shell, performing quality control inspections on an assembly line. 4 to 6 centuries of awareness without humanity. 4 to 6 centuries of remembering who I had been while functioning as what I had become. The door sealed behind them with a pneumatic hiss. Around me, the 37 other obsoletes sat in various stages of understanding. Some wept. Some stared. Hadrick simply closed his eyes, his hollow face finally showing something like peace. At least his consciousness wouldn't be preserved. At least he would be allowed to end. Jess's documents still lay scattered on the floor, their official seals and proper signatures meaningless in the face of cost-benefit analysis. I looked down at my hands, the hands that would soon be replaced by precision manipulator tools, the hands whose arthritis had condemned me to this. They were still shaking, but differently now. Not with fear or weakness, but with the tremor of someone who had finally understood the true cost of efficiency. The smell of the reclamation center, sterile chemicals, and something organic underneath filled my lungs. In 16 hours and 42 minutes, I would smell it from the other side. In 16 hours and 42 minutes, Marin Cross would end, and Unit 773 MK would begin. The countdown, like everything else in the Mechanicus, was perfectly precise. The holding chamber existed in a state of perpetual fluorescent daylight. There were no windows, no clocks, no way to mark the passage of time, except for the digital countdown displays mounted above each door. 40 of us now. 3 more had been brought in during what I assumed was night, though the white light never dimmed and the temperature never varied from its optimal 13.7 degrees Celsius. We sat on the plasteel benches in loose groupings defined by processing category. The displays told us everything. Our names, our ID numbers, our reclamation classifications, and the time remaining until we would be called through those doors. Hadrick Venin, ID 891, HV52, Category 3. Beta 40017033, Jessa. Cade, ID 1244, JC24, Category 4. Alpha 604218, Marin K. Ross, ID 7730, MK38, Category 1, Alpha 11, 28047. The smell had changed over the hours. At first, it had been pure industrial disinfectant. That sharp chemical scent that burned the inside of your nose and promised sterility. But as time passed and the processing continued beyond those sealed doors, something else began to seep through the ventilation. Something organic. Something that reminded me of the rendering facilities I'd glimpsed once on a tour of the lower manufacturing levels, where biological waste was converted into usable compounds. I tried not to think about what was being rendered on the other side of those walls. Hadric sat beside me, his countdown ticking below 4 hours. His face had achieved a strange serenity, the hollow emptiness replaced by something almost peaceful. He'd stopped talking hours ago, stopped responding to questions or commentary. He simply sat, hands resting on his degraded knees, watching the numbers descend. Jessa had not found peace. She paced the perimeter of the chamber, her breathing labored, one hand pressed protectively against her small belly. Every few minutes she would stop at the main door and press her palm against the access panel, as if hoping the maglocks might suddenly release. They never did. She would stand there for a moment, shoulders shaking with silent sobs, then resume her pacing. "They'll sedate her before processing," a woman near me whispered. She was Category 2 Beta, scheduled for partial servitor conversion. Lobotomized labor unit for the loading docks. The stress hormones corrupt the fetal development. They need the baby clean. I wondered how she knew this, then decided I didn't want to know. Around us, the other obsoletes existed in various states of acceptance. Some slept, or tried to, curled on the benches in fetal positions that might have been comforting if they weren't so ironically appropriate. Others talked in quiet clusters, sharing stories of their work lives, their families in the habitation blocks, the small moments of joy they'd carved from years of service. A few prayed to the Omniscia, their whispered litanies asking for mercy that wouldn't come or purpose that already had been assigned. One man, Category 5, Gamma, chemical compound extraction, had stopped moving entirely. He sat perfectly still, eyes open but unseeing, his mind already gone somewhere his body couldn't follow. A servitor had checked his vitals an hour ago and confirmed acceptable status. Brain death wasn't required until after processing began. At 0347 hours, by my internal count, Hadric's display reached 1 hour. A tone sounded, 3 soft chimes that made everyone in the chamber flinch. The processing door at the far end slid open, and Unit 773. Kappa emerged, its human eyes sweeping across the room until they locked on Hadric. "Subject Hadric Venn," it intoned through its Vox grill. "Report for Category 3. Beta processing." Hadric stood slowly, his damaged knee making the movement awkward. He looked down at me, and for a moment the hollow emptiness in his eyes filled with something almost human. "They don't waste anything," he said quietly. "Remember that. When your turn comes, they don't waste anything." Then he turned and walked toward the door, his limp pronounced but his posture straight. "Unit 773? Kappa let him through, and the door began to seal. "Wait!" someone called out. Can we see? Can we watch?" I thought the request was madness, but the servitor paused. Its human eyes swiveled toward the speaker, then toward the rest of us. Something that might have been calculation or might have been memory flickered across its augmetic features. "Observation serves educational efficiency," it said finally. "Reduces processing anxiety through comprehension. Authorized." A section of the wall beside the processing door turned transparent, not a window, but some kind of one-way aluminum viewport that revealed the chamber beyond. We could see in. Hadric couldn't see out. I wanted to look away. Every instinct screamed at me to close my eyes, to preserve whatever mercy ignorance might provide. But I found I couldn't. Some terrible part of me needed to know, needed to understand exactly what waited for me in 11 hours and 27 minutes. The processing chamber was smaller than I'd imagined. Maybe 4 meters square, dominated by a medical cradle in the center, all gleaming chrome and sterile plasteel. Hadric was directed to lie down, and restraints emerged automatically to secure his wrists, ankles, and forehead. Not to prevent movement, I realized. To ensure precision. Tech. Priest Genitor, Vox, 7, entered from a side door, accompanied by 2 surgical servitors, units even more specialized than 773. Kappa, their bodies almost entirely replaced by cutting tools and extraction equipment. Subject: Hadric. Ven. Category 3. Beta processing initiating. Vox 7 intoned. Organ harvest priority: cardiac, pulmonary, hepatic, renal. Skeletal reclamation secondary. Estimated processing time: 47 minutes. Anesthetic administration deemed resource inefficient for Category 3 subjects. Consciousness maintenance will facilitate organ preservation through continued biological function. Hadric's eyes went wide. Through speakers we couldn't see, we heard his voice. Wait. Wait. You're not going to. You can't. Pain receptors will be dampened to 40% baseline to prevent shock. Vox 7 continued, as if he hadn't spoken. Sufficient awareness maintained for optimal organ function during extraction. Comply with processing. Resistance decreases component viability. The first cut was surgical. Precise. The kind of incision I'd seen in medical diagrams. A clean Y-shaped opening across Hadric's chest. But diagrams don't bleed. Diagrams don't scream. Hadric screamed. The sound was muffled, dampened by whatever they'd done to his pain receptors. But it was still human. Still recognizable as the sound of a man experiencing something no human was meant to endure while conscious. The surgical servitors worked with mechanical efficiency, spreading his ribcage with specialized tools, exposing the organs beneath. His heart was still beating. I could see it pulsing in his open chest, maintaining the circulation that kept him alive and aware. Cardiac extraction initiating, Vox 7 announced. Subject awareness optimal. Harvesting in 3, 2, 1. They took his heart while he watched. I saw them clamp the major vessels, saw the precision cuts that separated the organ from its moorings, saw it lifted from his chest cavity in a surgical servitor's specialized graspers. Hadric's scream became a wet gurgle as his blood pressure plummeted, but the servitors were already connecting a mechanical pump to the severed vessels, not to save him, to keep the remaining organs viable for extraction. He was still conscious. I could see his eyes moving, tracking the servitors as they cataloged his heart, placed it in a preservation container marked cardiac, transplant grade, priority, alpha. His mouth moved, forming words nobody would hear or care about. The extraction continued with the same systematic efficiency I'd once admired on the assembly line. Lungs, liver, kidneys, each removed with clinical precision and cataloged for reuse. With each extraction, Hadric's body became less recognizable as human and more like the machinery that was replacing his biological functions. Tubes and pumps maintained circulation to the remaining organs. Chemical preservatives flooded his system. His consciousness was maintained not through mercy, but through the same efficiency that had condemned him, keeping the meat fresh while the harvest continued. At minute 32, they began the skeletal reclamation. I looked away then. I couldn't watch them break him down to components while some fragment of Hadric Ven still existed to experience it. Behind me, I heard others vomiting, weeping, praying. Jessa had collapsed on a bench, her breathing so rapid and shallow I thought she might pass out. When I forced myself to look back, Hadric was gone. What remained in the medical cradle was biological material awaiting final processing tissue to be rendered, bones to be ground for calcium supplements, and a head that still bore his face but no longer housed anything that could be called Hadric Ven. The entire process had taken 43 minutes. Category 3. Beta processing complete, Vox 7 announced. Reclamation efficiency, 87.4%. Component quality, acceptable. Initiating chamber sterilization for next subject. The viewport went opaque again, but I could still hear the sound of high-pressure chemical sprays cleaning Hadric from the room, making it ready for the next Obsolete. For Jessa, whose countdown now showed less than 3 hours, she knew it too. I saw the exact moment the knowledge crystallized in her mind. Her face went from terrified to desperate, the mathematics of survival suddenly brutally clear. If she stayed, they would take her baby and render her into paste. But if she could escape, if she could somehow reach the upper levels, it was a fantasy, of course. Security in the reclamation center was absolute. But fear doesn't listen to logic, and maternal instinct doesn't accept impossible mathematics. At 0512 hours, during what passed for shift change, Jessa made her attempt. The servitor rotation occurred with mechanical regularity. One unit departing for recharging, while another arrived to maintain observation. For exactly 47 seconds, there was only one servitor in the chamber, its attention divided between monitoring us and interfacing with the replacement unit. Jessa ran. Her pregnant belly made her movements awkward, graceless, but desperation gave her speed. She crossed the chamber in seconds and slammed her palm against the emergency door release, the one marked for fire evacuation that I'd assumed was sealed like everything else. It was sealed, but Jessa had been a sanitation worker. She knew the codes for chemical emergency overrides, the back doors designed for evacuating workers during toxic spills. Her fingers flew across the panel, entering sequences that should have been impossible for her to know. The door cracked open. Just a few centimeters, but enough. Then the alarm sounded. It wasn't the soft chimes that announced processing. This was a wailing klaxon that made my bones vibrate, a sound designed to trigger primal fear and compliance. Red warning lights strobed across the white walls, turning the sterile chamber into something from a nightmare. Security servitors emerged from ports I hadn't even known existed. Not medical units like 773 Kappa, but combat models, heavy assault frames with reinforced armor and pacification equipment. They'd once been human, probably. Guardsmen or enforcers who'd suffered injuries beyond repair. Now, they were the Mechanicus' security infrastructure. Consciousness stripped away to leave only response protocols and violence. Jessa had made it maybe 4 meters into the corridor when they caught her. The first servitor's shock maul hit her in the lower back, and she went down hard. Not unconscious. They needed her conscious for processing. But paralyzed from the waist down, her legs suddenly useless. She tried to crawl, her fingers scrabbling against the white floor, one hand still pressed against her belly as if she could protect what was inside. They dragged her back into the holding chamber, her fingernails leaving thin scratches on the pristile that vanished as nano-cleaners rushed to erase the evidence of her resistance. Tech. Priest Genitor Vox. 7 arrived within minutes, its mechadendrites twitching with what I now recognized as mechanical agitation. Subject. Jessa Kaid, it intoned, its binary cant somehow conveying disapproval. Non-compliance detected. Resistance identified. Processing priority escalated. Category 4. Alpha. Immediate implementation authorized. No, Jessa gasped, her voice barely audible. Please, please, just the baby. Take the baby and let me go. I'll work. I'll accept any assignment. Cost-benefit analysis does not support negotiation, Vox 7 interrupted. Non-compliance has compromised fetal stress hormone levels by 34%. Immediate extraction required to preserve gestation viability. Subject processing will proceed concurrently. Estimated efficiency, 91.3%. They took her through the processing door while she screamed for her baby. This time, nobody asked to watch. But Unit 773 Kappa activated the viewport anyway. Educational efficiency, it had said. Maybe it was right. Maybe we needed to see this. Maybe understanding was the only mercy left. The process was faster than Hadrick's. Category 4. Alpha didn't require careful organ preservation, just rapid fetal extraction and biological matter conversion. They sedated Jessa for the baby's sake, not for hers. The chemical cocktail kept her muscles relaxed and her hormone levels stable while they opened her abdomen with surgical precision. The fetus, barely recognizable as human at 14 weeks, but undeniably alive, was removed and placed immediately into a portable gestation tank. It would be transferred to the natal facilities, brought to term in artificial amniotic fluid, and born into a life of guaranteed service to the Mechanicus, a worker unit produced at optimal efficiency, unmarred by the biological inefficiency of traditional birth. Then they processed Jessa. Category 4 meant biological paste conversion. Total reclamation through chemical rendering. I watched them place her sedated body into what looked like a massive industrial blender, watched the chemical catalysts flood the chamber, watched biological matter break down into constituent proteins and compounds with the same efficiency we used to render failed components on the assembly line. 14 minutes from living human to nutrient paste. Efficiency 91.3%. The viewport went dark. Around me, the holding chamber had gone silent. Even the prayers had stopped. What was there to pray for? What mercy existed in a system that turned pregnancy into a reclamation efficiency percentage? My countdown read 9,142-2. Processing categories, a servitor announced to no one in particular. Educational overview for remaining subjects. A hololithic display materialized in the center of the chamber, clinical diagrams showing the 5 categories of reclamation. Category 1, full consciousness servitor conversion. Nervous system preserved, integrated with mechanical systems. Subject awareness maintained for enhanced performance of complex tasks. Estimated operational lifespan, 200 to 600 years. Reserved for subjects with valuable skill sets and neural tissue quality above 90% baseline. Category 2. Partial servitor conversion. Frontal lobe removed. Consciousness eliminated. Basic motor functions preserved for simple labor. Estimated operational lifespan, 50 to 100 years. Standard processing for degraded workers with minimal specialized skills. Category 3. Organ and tissue harvest. Subject consciousness maintained during extraction to preserve organ viability through continued biological function. Components redistributed for augmetic transplantation. Remaining biological matter rendered for chemical reclamation. Processing time, 40 to 60 minutes. Rapid chemical rendering of total biological mass. Used when organ viability is compromised or immediate processing is required. Resulting paste utilized in nutrient supplements and chemical synthesis. Processing time, 10 to 20 minutes. Category 5, specialized chemical extraction. Reserved for subjects with specific biological compounds of value, rare blood types, hormonal markers, genetic material for clone production. Subject consciousness, irrelevant. Processing time, variable. I was Category 1. The holograph showed me exactly what that meant. They would preserve my consciousness, not as a gift, but as a tool. My 17 years of quality control experience would be integrated with mechanical systems. Optical enhancements to detect microscopic flaws, haptic sensors to feel material stress, processing speed increased to superhuman levels. I would become the perfect inspection servitor, consciousness trapped in a shell designed for one purpose and one purpose only. The irony was precise. I would inspect the same assembly line I'd supervised as human, the same components flowing past at the same 3.7 per second, the same efficiency requirements, the same quality thresholds, everything, the same except me. Subject, Marin Cross, Unit 773. Kappa intoned, drifting toward me. Pre-procedure preparation initiating. Preparatory injections required. I didn't resist. What would be the point? I'd watched Hadrick's systematic disassembly and Jess's reduction to paste. I knew exactly what resistance earned you. Faster processing, lower efficiency ratings, the same outcome with additional suffering. The servitor extended a manipulator arm, tipped with an injection system. The first needle slid into my arm with practiced precision. Muscle relaxant, it explained in its mechanical voice. Prevents involuntary movement during consciousness, preservation procedures. Maintains physical immobility while neural activity remains optimal. I felt it spreading through my body, a creeping numbness that started in my extremities and worked inward. My fingers went slack first, the arthritis pain vanishing not because it was healed, but because I could no longer feel my hands at all. Then my arms, my legs, my torso, all sensation fading into absence. But my mind remained crystal clear. Neural preservative, the servitor continued, administering a second injection directly into the base of my skull. Protects cognitive functions during augmetic integration. Ensures consciousness maintenance throughout processing and operational lifespan. This one burned. I felt it spreading through my brain like liquid fire, each neuron suddenly hyper-aware and screaming. Then the sensation stabilized into a kind of heightened clarity, every thought sharp-edged, every memory vivid, every moment of awareness amplified. They wanted me conscious, they wanted me aware. They wanted me to know exactly what was happening and remember it all. Pre-procedure preparation complete. Unit 773, Kappa announced. Subject neural activity, 97% baseline. Consciousness, preservation, optimal. Processing will commence in 8 hours, 47 minutes. I sat on the bench, my body numb, but my mind terribly, perfectly aware. I could think. I could remember. I could understand. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except exist in this heightened state of consciousness while I waited for them to strip away everything except that consciousness itself. Around me, other Category 1 subjects received their injections. I watched their faces go slack as their bodies succumbed to the muscle relaxants, watched their eyes remain bright and aware as the neural preservatives took effect. We were becoming ghosts in our own flesh, minds trapped in bodies that no longer responded, preparing for an existence where that state would become permanent. My countdown ticked downward with mechanical precision. 8, 4, 6, 4, 7, 4, 6, 4, 6, 4, 6, 8, 4, 6, 5, 9. Hadrick had told me they don't waste anything. He was right. They were keeping every part of me that had value, consciousness, skill, memory, awareness. They were just removing everything that made that consciousness human. My hands, the ones I could no longer feel, would become precision manipulator tools. My eyes, still seeing but soon to be replaced, would become inspection-grade optics. My body, this flesh that had served me for 38 years, would be stripped away and redistributed to more efficient purposes. But my mind would remain. That was the gift and the curse of Category 1 alpha processing. I would remember being Marin Cross, would remember 17 years of supervision, of efficiency ratings, of taking pride in my 99.7% productivity, would remember the arthritis that had condemned me and the fumbled authorization that had triggered my audit. And I would spend the next 4 to 6 centuries performing quality control inspections on assembly line Delta 7, conscious and aware and utterly unable to be anything except what they had made me. The smell of industrial disinfectant couldn't quite mask the organic undertone anymore. I knew what that smell was now. It was the scent of efficiency, the scent of optimal resource reclamation, the scent of humanity rendered down to its most useful components. In 8 hours and 45 minutes, I would become part of that scent. The countdown continued its perfect, mechanical descent toward zero. The surgical theater was beautiful in its sterility. Pure white ceramite walls rose to a ceiling lined with harsh lumen strips that cast no shadows, creating a space of absolute illumination where nothing could hide. 17 medical cradles stood in precise rows, each one occupied by a Category 1 alpha subject in various stages of conversion. The air tasted of ozone and chemical sterilization, scrubbed so clean it felt thin in my lungs. The last breaths I would take with organic respiratory tissue. They transferred me from the holding chamber at exactly 0 hours. My countdown had reached 0, and with it, Marin Cross's final moments as something recognizably human. The servitors positioned me on the central cradle with mechanical efficiency, my paralyzed body handled like the component it would soon become. Restraints emerged from the cradle's frame. Not to hold me still, since the muscle relaxants had already ensured compliance, but to maintain precise positioning during the systematic disassembly and reconstruction. I could see everything. The neural preservatives had heightened my awareness to an almost painful degree, and the cradle had been tilted at a 15-degree angle that gave me a perfect view of the surgical theater. To my left, a subject was already in Phase 2, their chest cavity open, organs being harvested while their eyes tracked the movements with numb horror. To my right, another subject was being fitted with their first augmetic limbs, the mechanical arms interfacing with nerve clusters that still sent phantom signals of pain despite the dampeners. And directly above me, suspended from the ceiling, was a sheet of mirror-polished chrome that reflected my face back at me. They wanted me to watch. Educational efficiency, perhaps. Or maybe something deeper. A final lesson about the cost of biological inefficiency. Tech. Priest Genitor Vox 7 moved between the cradles with its characteristic gliding motion, mechadendrites checking readouts and adjusting settings. When it reached my position, its human eye and augmetic optics focused on me with clinical interest. Subject Marin Cross, Category 1. Alpha conversion initiating, it intoned in its flat binary cant. Consciousness preservation protocols active. Neural activity 97.3% baseline. Optimal for procedure. Processing sequence, skeletal integration, organic reclamation, neural interface installation, sensory replacement. Estimated duration 4 hours, 17 minutes. Subject will remain conscious throughout to facilitate real-time neural mapping and integration testing. 4 hours and 17 minutes. I would be awake for all of it. Pain receptors will be maintained at 60% baseline during skeletal integration, Vox 7 continued. This ensures careful handling of new augmetic systems and prevents damage through overly aggressive initial usage. Pain serves function. Pain creates learning. Comply with processing. I wanted to scream that I had no choice in compliance, that my paralyzed body had surrendered all agency. But I had no voice. The muscle relaxants had stolen even that. A surgical servitor approached. Unit 447. Sigma, according to its designation plate. Its body had been reduced to the essential components for precision surgery. A torso mounted on anti-grav units, multiple manipulator arms ending in specialized tools, and optical arrays that could see to the cellular level. It positioned itself at my left side and extended a cutting implement toward my shoulder. Phase 1 initiating, Vox 7 announced. Skeletal integration. Limb removal and augmetic replacement. The first cut was clinical. A perfect circular incision around my left shoulder joint, cutting through skin and muscle with thermal precision that cauterized as it went. I felt it, not the full screaming agony it should have been, but a muted version that was somehow worse. The dampeners had stolen the relief of unconsciousness while leaving enough sensation to ensure I understood what was happening. I watched in the mirror as they peeled back the layers of my arm, exposing the joint beneath. My arm. The one I'd used to authorize production quotas for 17 years. The one whose arthritis had condemned me to this. Now just biological material awaiting removal. The bone saw came next. I felt the vibration before I heard it. A deep resonance that traveled through my skeleton like a screen made solid. The saw touched my humerus and began cutting, and I experienced something beyond pain. It was violation. The fundamental wrongness of feeling your own bones being severed while you were made conscious and aware. 3 minutes and 47 seconds. That's how long it took to remove my left arm. They placed it on a sterile tray beside the cradle, and I could still see it in my peripheral vision. Still recognizably mine, still bearing the small scar on my wrist from a welding accident in my first year of service. But it wasn't mine anymore. It was biological salvage, scheduled for organic reclamation processing. The automatic replacement was already waiting. A precision manipulator arm, all gleaming chrome and servo motors, designed specifically for quality control inspection work. The surgical servitor aligned it with the exposed joint and began the integration process, drilling into bone, threading synthetic nerves through tissue, fusing metal to flesh with molecular bonding agents. When they activated the neural interface, I felt my new arm. Not like feeling a limb, like feeling a tool. The sensations were different, alien, translated through haptic feedback systems into something my brain could process but never truly understand as human. I could sense pressure, texture, temperature, but filtered through mechanical precision. When the servitor commanded me to flex the manipulator's digits, they responded with movements far more precise than flesh had ever managed. My arthritis was gone. So was my humanity. They removed my right arm next, then my legs, both of them, since inspection servitors required only a stable mounting platform, not ambulatory capability. Each amputation followed the same procedure: cut, saw, remove, replace. Each time, I watched in the mirror as parts of Mechanicus were stripped away and replaced with mechanisms designed for singular purpose. By the end of Phase 1, I was a torso and head mounted on a support frame, my limbs replaced by 4 manipulator arms of varying sizes and specializations. My spine had been fused to a vertical stabilizer that would allow 360-degree rotation for optimal inspection coverage. My pelvis had been replaced entirely by a mounting bracket compatible with standard assembly line positioning systems. I looked at my reflection and saw something that was no longer human. Phase 1 complete, Vox 7 announced. Skeletal integration successful. Limb response testing optimal. Neural adaptation within acceptable parameters. Proceeding to Phase 2. Phase 2 was organ removal. Organic systems unnecessary for servitor function will be harvested for redistribution. Vox 7 explained, as if I were a student rather than a victim. Consciousness preservation requires only neural tissue and essential support systems. Cardiac, pulmonary, and digestive functions will be replaced with mechanical equivalents of superior efficiency. The surgical servitor made the Y incision across my chest with practiced efficiency. I felt them spread my ribcage, felt the bones separate with a sound like breaking branches. In the mirror, I watched my own chest cavity open like a machine being disassembled from maintenance. My heart was still beating. I could see it pulsing in the exposed cavity, maintaining the circulation that kept me alive and aware. The surgical servitor extended a specialized grasper and carefully isolated the major vessels. Cardiac extraction initiating, Vox 7 intoned. Subject consciousness optimal. Organ viability 87%. Designated for Tech Priest Magos Sarn 4. Obmetic heart replacement surgery scheduled in 4 hours. They were going to give my heart to someone else. To a tech priest who needed a replacement organ, who would receive this piece of me and never know or care about the woman it had once sustained. My heart, which had beat 1.3 billion times over my 38 years, which had raced with pride at efficiency milestones and fear at audit notices, would pump blood in a stranger's chest before this day ended. The clamps came first, sealing off the vessels. Then the cuts. Precise and clinical, separating the organ from its moorings. I felt the moment my heart stopped beating in my chest, felt the strange emptiness as it was lifted away, felt my consciousness waver as blood pressure plummeted. Then the mechanical pump activated. It was nothing like a heartbeat, no rhythmic pulse, no organic tempo, just constant pressure, maintaining circulation with mechanical perfection, more efficient than biology. More reliable, incapable of the weakness that had made my original heart obsolete. I watched them place my heart in a preservation container, watched them seal it, label it, send it gliding away on an automated transport toward someone who would be saved by my condemnation. My lungs went next, removed and replaced by chemical oxygenation systems that would feed my blood directly without the inefficiency of respiration. No more breathing. No more tasting the air of the manufactorum or feeling the expansion of my chest. Just chemical processes maintaining the minimum biology needed to keep neural tissue alive. My digestive system followed, stomach, intestines, all the complex organic machinery of nutrition removed and replaced by an intravenous nutrient paste delivery system. I would never eat again. Never taste food or feel hunger or experience the small comfort of a meal. Just chemical sustenance maintaining biological function at minimum necessary levels. With each extraction, I became less human and more machine. My reflection in the mirror showed a torso that was more hollow than solid, more mechanism than flesh. My organs, catalogued and preserved, were wheeled away to serve other purposes. My liver would filter toxins in some underhive factory worker's body. My kidneys would process waste in a manufactorum overseer. My intestines would be rendered for chemical compounds. They were recycling me, redistributing my components across the Imperium with the same efficiency I had once applied to quality control. Phase 2 complete, Vox 7 announced. Organic reclamation, 94.7% efficiency. Subject consciousness maintained. Neural activity, 94.1% baseline. Acceptable degradation. Proceeding to Phase 3. Phase 3 was neural interface installation. This was the core of Category 1 alpha processing, the procedure that separated consciousness-preserved servitors from simple lobotomized labor units. They would map my neural pathways, integrate them with cogitator systems, and transform my mind into an organic processor slaved to mechanical function. The surgical servitor repositioned above my head, its cutting tools glinting in the harsh lumen light. I felt the clamps securing my skull, felt them tighten until I couldn't move even the fraction of a degree the muscle relaxants might have permitted. Then, I felt the bone saw touch my skull. The sound was worse than when they'd removed my limbs. This was my head, my skull. The final fortress protecting the consciousness that was Marin Cross. And they were opening it like a maintenance hatch on a machine. The vibration traveled through my entire skeleton, my fused spine transmitting every resonance of the saw cutting through bone. I felt them lift away, the section of skull, felt cool air touch my exposed brain tissue, felt the fundamental vulnerability of having my thoughts physically accessible to the mechanized precision of the Mechanicus. Cortical mapping initiating, Vox 7 said. Subject will experience temporary disorientation as neural pathways are indexed. Temporary was an interesting word for what happened next. They inserted the mapping probes, dozens of them, each one a thread-thin wire that penetrated my brain tissue and began reading the electrical patterns of my thoughts. I felt each insertion, not as pain, but as intrusion. as violation of the final private space that had been mine alone. And then my memories started downloading. I could feel it happening. Each thought, each experience, each moment of my 17 years of service being copied to cogitator banks. I remembered my first day on the assembly line and simultaneously felt that memory being read, compressed, filed as data. I remembered my promotion to supervisor and felt the experience being reduced to binary code. I remembered the morning my efficiency dropped and felt that moment being archived as the inciting incident in my case file. My entire life was being copied, not stolen. The original memories remained, but now they existed in duplicate. In the Mechanicus data stacks, my experiences had become Imperial property. My 17 years of expertise would be available for analysis, optimization, and transfer to future servitor units long after my consciousness finally degraded. Memory integration, 73% complete, Vox 7 announced. Consciousness continuity maintained, subject identity retention, optimal. They wanted me to remember who I had been. That was the cruelty of it. They weren't erasing Maren Cross. They were preserving her, trapping her consciousness in a shell designed for servitude, ensuring she would remember her humanity while being utterly incapable of expressing it. The cortical plugs came next. Larger interface ports drilled directly into specific brain regions: motor cortex, visual cortex, sensory processing centers. Each one created a permanent hardline connection between my organic neural tissue and the mechanical systems that would control my servitor body. When they activated the connections, I felt my thoughts begin to run on rails. It was subtle at first, just a slight sense of guidance when I tried to think about movement. My new manipulator arms responded not to conscious choice, but to algorithmic optimization. I thought about reaching, and my servitors calculated the most efficient trajectory. I thought about grasping, and my haptic sensors determined optimal pressure before I'd even completed the thought. My consciousness was becoming middleware. Still present, still aware, but increasingly relegated to observer status while optimization protocols handled actual function. Phase 3 complete, Vox 7 intoned. Neural interface installation successful. Consciousness integration, 89.4%. Excellent retention. Subject will retain full awareness of identity, purpose, and transformation. Proceeding to Phase 4. Phase 4 was sensory replacement. They started with my eyes. The surgical servitor positioned optical cutting tools above my face, and I saw my final moment of human vision reflected in the mirror. My face, pale and bloodless, my body, a grotesque fusion of flesh and mechanism, my eyes wide with a terror I couldn't express. Ocular extraction initiating, Vox 7 said. Subject will maintain visual input through direct cortical feed during transition. Temporary disorientation is acceptable. The first eye went dark. Not blind, disconnected. I felt the severance of the optic nerve, felt them lift the organic eye from its socket. For a moment, I existed in a strange half-vision, seeing the world through one human eye and one empty socket. Then the cortical feed activated, and I could see again. But differently. The new vision fed directly into my brain, bypassing the organic processing that had interpreted light into sight. I could see wavelengths I'd never perceived before. Ultraviolet markers on components, infrared heat signatures, microscopic surface flaws invisible to human eyes. I could zoom my focus, could analyze material composition through spectral analysis, could process visual information at speeds that made my old perception seem sluggish. I could see the microscopic stress fractures in the mirror above me, could see the individual molecules of the surgical servitor's cutting tools, could see my remaining human eye being extracted and placed in a preservation container, its green iris staring back at me from inside sterile fluid. The inspection-grade optics that replaced my eyes were perfect, flawless, capable of detecting variances measured in nanometers. I would never miss a defective component, would never let a flawed widget pass quality control. I would be the perfect inspector. That was the point. "Acoustic sensors installing," Vox 7 announced. My ears were removed with the same clinical efficiency, replaced with sensors that could hear frequencies beyond human range. The subtle stress harmonics of metal fatigue, the acoustic signatures of imperfect welds, the rhythmic variations that indicated machinery operating outside optimal parameters. I could hear 17 different assembly lines operating simultaneously in the manufactorums above us. Could hear the variance in their efficiency ratings just from the sound. Could identify which machines needed maintenance from the frequency patterns of their operation. My tongue and nose were removed next. Taste and smell, unnecessary for quality control function, replaced by chemical analysis ports that could detect material composition through atmospheric sampling. I would never taste food again, but I could identify steel alloy percentages by airborne particulates. Finally, they replaced my sense of touch. Not removed. Translated. My skin was infiltrated with haptic feedback systems that converted pressure into data about material stress, texture into surface finishing quality, temperature into operational heat signatures. When they tested my new tactile systems, I could feel the molecular structure of the metal components they placed in my manipulator arms. I wasn't touching anymore. I was analyzing. Every sensation filtered through purpose, through function, through the singular goal of quality control inspection. Phase 4 complete, Vox 7 said. Sensory replacement successful. All systems, integration, optimal. Subject. Marin Cross has been successfully converted to Unit 773, MK, Quality Control Inspection. Servitor, Assembly Line. Delta 7, Designation. I looked at my reflection and saw what I had become. A torso. More mechanism than flesh mounted on a vertical stabilizer. 4 manipulator arms, each ending in specialized tools for handling and analyzing components. Optical sensors that glowed with a faint amber light. Acoustic receivers that swiveled to track sound sources. A Vox grill where my mouth had been, capable of reporting findings but not of expressing emotion. I was a living quality control machine. The full horror of it crystallized in that moment. They hadn't killed me. They'd perfected me. They'd stripped away everything that made me human and left only the parts that served their purpose. My consciousness, my experience, my knowledge. Trapped in a shell designed for one function and one function only. I would spend the next 4 to 6 centuries examining components on assembly line Delta 7, the same line I'd supervised as human. The same 3.7 components per second. The same efficiency requirements. The same quota I'd failed to meet with my arthritic hands. Except now, I would never fail. My new optical sensors could detect flaws I'd never seen as human. My haptic feedback could sense stress fractures before they became visible. My processing speed could analyze components faster than human consciousness could register. I would inspect 73 million components per year. At 4 centuries of service, that would be 29 billion inspections. Each one perfect. Each one precise. Each one performed while I remained fully conscious and aware of what I had been and what I could never be again. I would detect flaws I myself had missed as a supervisor. Would reject components that had passed my human inspection. Would be more efficient than Marin Cross had ever managed. The arthritis that had condemned me was gone. So was everything else. Consciousness. Diagnostic running. Vox 7 said, manipulating controls I couldn't see. Data scrolled across displays, neural activity graphs, consciousness retention percentages, psychological baseline comparisons. Neural activity, 89.4% of pre-conversion baseline, the tech priest announced with what might have been satisfaction. Consciousness, retention, excellent. Memory integration, complete. Subject, retains full awareness of identity, personal history, and circumstances of conversion. Existential horror response, present but non-functional. All metrics within acceptable parameters for Category 1, Alpha Servitor Operation. Existential horror response, present but non-functional. They knew I was horrified. The diagnostics had measured my psychological state and quantified my suffering, and they'd classified it as non-functional, present, but not interfering with my ability to perform quality control inspections. My horror served no purpose. Therefore, it was irrelevant. I tried to scream, tried to force sound through the Vox grill, tried to express the magnitude of what they'd done to me. But my vocal systems weren't connected to my consciousness. They were slaved to reporting protocols. When I tried to scream, what emerged was a flat mechanical voice reporting system status. Unit 773. NK functional. All systems optimal. Awaiting assignment to Assembly Line Delta 7, Station 3 Alpha.
That was my scream. That was my expression of horror and loss and violation.
System status reports. I couldn't even weep. My tear ducts had been removed with my eyes. Conversion complete, Vox 7 announced. Processing time, 4 hours, 19 minutes. Efficiency rating, 97.3%. Unit 773. NK approved for deployment. Transport to assembly line. Delta 7 authorized. First shift commences in 47 minutes. 47 minutes. Less than an hour remained before I would begin my eternal service. Before I would take my position on the assembly line and begin inspecting components while Marin Cross's consciousness watched from inside a servitor shell. They disconnected me from the medical cradle. My stabilizer locked into transport mode, and a servitor, one of the simple lobotomized units that had no consciousness to suffer, guided me toward the exit. As I left the surgical theater, I saw new subjects being positioned on the cradles. Category 1. Alpha candidates, their faces reflecting the same terror I had felt 4 hours ago. I wanted to warn them, wanted to tell them that consciousness preservation wasn't a mercy. It was the cruelest torture the Mechanicus could devise. But I had no voice for warning, only for reporting defects and efficiency metrics. The transport corridor was the same sterile white as everything else in sublevel Epsilon. But I saw it differently now. Saw the microscopic imperfections in the walls, the slight temperature gradients, the acoustic signatures of hidden machinery. My new senses were already cataloging everything, already optimizing, already serving function. We passed a viewing port into one of the organ storage chambers. Through my enhanced optics, I could see the preservation containers lined up in precise rows. Somewhere in there was my heart, waiting to pump blood in a tech priest's chest. My lungs, scheduled for installation in a manufactorum overseer. My eyes, perhaps destined for a servitor that needed organic components. I had been distributed across the Imperium with optimal efficiency. All except my consciousness. That they had kept. Trapped it in metal and machinery. Preserved it not as mercy, but as enhancement. The ghost in the machine that would make me more efficient than any lobotomized servitor could be. The transport delivered me to an equipment elevator. As we ascended through the levels, Epsilon, Delta, Gamma, Beta, Alpha, I felt each one as a return to familiarity. These were the levels I had known as human. The levels where workers lived and served and eventually failed their efficiency requirements. The levels that fed the reclamation center with a steady stream of obsolete biological assets. When the elevator opened onto the alpha-level manufactorum floor, I heard it immediately. The thunder of assembly line Delta 7 operating at peak efficiency. My line. My responsibility for 17 years. Now my prison for the next 4 to 6 centuries. They positioned me at Station 3 Alpha, locking my stabilizer into the mounting bracket. The assembly line stretched before me in both directions, 300 meters of conveyor systems and holy machinery, exactly as I remembered. Except I remembered it as Marin Cross, as a supervisor who took pride in her efficiency rating, as a human who believed service to the Omnitia had meaning beyond mathematics. Now I was Unit 773, NK, a quality control inspection servitor, a consciousness preserved in machinery, existing only to examine components flowing past at 3.7 per second. My shift began in 12 minutes. I had eternity to reflect on the fact that 3% efficiency variance had been enough to transform me from a person into a tool. The assembly line thundered on, waiting for my perfect mechanical service. And I, what remained of Marin Cross, had no choice but to provide it. Activation came without warning. One moment I existed in a liminal space between consciousness and dormancy, aware but disconnected, thinking but not experiencing. The next, my systems engaged with mechanical precision, and I was thrust back into full awareness of what I had become. No gradual awakening. No moment of confusion or disorientation. Just the sudden, brutal clarity of consciousness restored to a body that was no longer a body. I had no sense of my physical form in the way humans understand it. No feeling of weight or balance. No awareness of breathing or heartbeat. Those sensations belonged to flesh, and I had been stripped of most of mine. What remained was function. A constant stream of data about system status, power levels, operational parameters. My existence had been reduced to diagnostic readouts and efficiency metrics. I was positioned at Station 3 Alpha, assembly line Delta 7. The mounting bracket held my stabilizer at the optimal height for component inspection, precisely 13 meters above the conveyor surface. My 4 manipulator arms were locked in rest position, their servos idling at minimal power consumption. My optical sensors focused automatically on the assembly line stretching before me. My line! The one I had supervised for 17 years as Marin Cross. The irony was so precise, it felt intentional. I could see the entire production floor from my elevated position. 300 workers at their stations, performing the same tasks they'd performed yesterday and would perform tomorrow. Assembly, welding, quality spot checks, material handling, all the human functions that kept the manufactorum running. They moved with practiced efficiency, each one a component in the greater machine of imperial production. None of them recognized me. Why would they? I wasn't Supervisor Cross anymore. I was Unit 773. MK, another piece of equipment installed for optimal productivity. Just another servitor among the dozens that dotted the assembly line, indistinguishable from the lobotomized units except for the consciousness trapped inside. At 0600 hours exactly, the shift klaxon sounded. The assembly line shuddered to life with a thunder. I could now hear in frequencies I'd never perceived as human. The machinery didn't just rumble, it sang, each component contributing to a complex acoustic signature that told me everything about operational status. Bearing wear and conveyor motor. 7. Slight misalignment in hydraulic press. 4. Optimal function in all sorting mechanisms. I knew all this before the first component reached my station. The first widget appeared at the edge of my optical range, 2.7 seconds after line activation. A hull plating segment stamped from reinforced plasteel, destined for some Imperial Guard transport that would carry soldiers to wars I would never see. It moved toward me at exactly 3.7 components per second, the same rate I'd monitored as a supervisor, the same quota I'd maintained at 99.7% efficiency. My manipulator arms moved without conscious direction. The primary grasper intercepted the component with mechanical precision, rotating it through optimal inspection angles while my optical sensors scanned every surface. Spectral analysis confirmed material composition. Structural integrity assessment detected no stress fractures. Dimensional tolerances measured within acceptable parameters. Surface finishing quality adequate. Total inspection time, 0.27 seconds. The component passed. My manipulators released it back to the conveyor, and my systems immediately focused on the next widget arriving at my station. I hadn't chosen to inspect the first component, hadn't decided to release it, hadn't consciously performed any part of the process. My servitor body had simply executed its function while my consciousness observed from somewhere inside the machinery. The second component arrived. Inspect. Analyze. Release. 0.26 seconds. The third component. Inspect. Analyze. Release. 2.8 seconds. The fourth component showed a flaw. My optical sensors detected it immediately, a true 0.03 millimeter variance in the hull plating thickness, barely visible even to my enhanced vision. A stress concentration point that would lead to catastrophic failure after approximately 2,807 hours of operational use. Fatal to the soldiers who would depend on this transport's armor integrity. My manipulators rotated the component to confirm the flaw. My chemical analysis ports verified the material composition variance. My haptic sensors measured the exact dimensional deviation. Then, my Vox grill activated without my volition, reporting in a flat mechanical voice. Component 004. Batch 773. Alpha. Flaw detected. Hull plating thickness variance 0.03 mm, sector 4B. Failure mode. Stress fracture under combat load. Reject. Stamped. My manipulators pressed the component against a marking die, stamping it with the red rejection sigil. Then they moved it to the discard conveyor with the same precision they'd used to inspect it. I hadn't decided to reject the component, hadn't chosen to speak the findings. My consciousness had simply watched while my servitor systems executed their programming. Total processing time, including rejection, 0.41 seconds. The assembly line continued. Components flowed past at their relentless 3.7 per second. My manipulators intercepted each one with mechanical perfection. Inspect. Analyze. Accept or reject. Report findings. Return to line or divert to discard. Over and over and over. I tried to slow down. It was an impulse born of desperation rather than reason. Some fragment of Marin Cross asserting that I should still have control over my own actions. I focused my consciousness on my primary manipulator arm, willing it to move slower, to delay the interception of the next component by even a fraction of a second. The arm didn't respond to my will. It responded to optimization protocols. The component arrived. My manipulator intercepted it at maximum efficiency. My consciousness screamed at the servos to slow down, to demonstrate that some core of humanity remained, that I wasn't just a passenger in this mechanical shell. The inspection completed in 4.25 seconds. My efficiency was improving. I tried to stop entirely. Tried to freeze my systems, to refuse function, to demonstrate through non-compliance that Marin Cross still existed inside Unit 773. NK. Override protocols engaged immediately. I felt them activate like a hand tightening around my consciousness. Behavioral modification systems integrated into my neural interface during Phase 3 of my conversion. When I tried to inhibit my servitor functions, The protocol simply bypassed my volition and executed the required tasks directly through my motor cortex. My manipulators continued their work while my consciousness struggled uselessly against programming. I couldn't resist. I tried to fail an inspection, tried to let a flawed component pass, to prove that I retained some agency, some ability to make choices even if those choices were wrong. The accuracy subroutines activated before I could complete the thought. My optical sensors detected the flaw, a 0.02 millimeter surface irregularity, and my Vox grill reported it before my consciousness had finished deciding to ignore it. Component 0847, batch 773, Alpha. Flaw detected, surface finishing variance, 002 Amaniers, Sector 7C. Failure mode, seal integrity compromise. Reject stamped. I wasn't choosing to inspect. I wasn't deciding to report. I wasn't performing any function through conscious will. I was just there. A consciousness preserved to observe my own eternal labor. A ghost trapped in a machine that no longer needed my input to perform the tasks I'd been designed for. My role wasn't to work, it was to witness my own perfect mechanical servitude. The realization settled over me like ice water through circuits that could no longer feel cold. Then I became aware of the others. It started as a sensation I had no name for, something between hearing and feeling, processed through neural pathways that hadn't existed before my conversion. A sense of presence, like distant lights in darkness, scattered across the assembly line and throughout the manufactorum. Other consciousness, preserved servitors. I could sense them, the way I could sense the electromagnetic fields around the machinery, the way I could detect the acoustic signatures of the assembly line. They existed in my awareness as points of isolated consciousness, each one trapped in their own servitor shell, each one performing their designated function while some fragment of humanity screamed silently inside. There was one at Station 4, closer than the others, its presence somehow familiar. I focused my optical sensors and saw Unit 773 Kappa, the medical assessment servitor from the Reclamation Center. The one whose designation plate had marked it as starting service, the same year I had. The one who had been a supervisor too. Through the strange sense. That wasn't sense. I could feel its consciousness, not its thoughts. We had no capacity for true communication, no system designed for servitor-to-servitor interaction. But I could sense its awareness, could feel the weight of its existence, the way one consciousness recognizes another. How long had it been working? The designation records would show the answer. But I didn't need records. I could sense it in the quality of its presence. The particular character of consciousness that had endured this existence for longer than seemed possible. Quander 7 years. It had been a medical assessment servitor for 127 years. Still conscious. Still aware. Still trapped, I tried to reach out, to make some connection that might ease the isolation. But there was nothing. No shared language, no communication protocol. No way to say, I understand, or you're not alone, or even just, I'm sorry. We existed in parallel conscious, but isolated, aware, but unable to share that awareness, suffering, but unable to offer or receive comfort, lonely together. The cruelty of it was exquisite. The Mechanicus had preserved our consciousness ostensibly to enhance our efficiency, but this secondary effect, this eternal isolation in shared servitude, seemed almost intentional. We could sense each other's existence just enough to know we weren't alone, but not enough to derive any comfort from it. We were witnesses to each other's eternal function, unable to acknowledge or ease each other's suffering. Unit 773, MK, increase inspection rate by 4%. The voice came from behind me, Young, female, carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I rotated my optical sensors to track the speaker, my servitor body responding to external stimulus while my consciousness processed the horror of recognition. The new supervisor was 29 years old, her work coveralls bearing the insignia of Assembly Line Delta 7 Management. Her face was smooth and unlined, her movements efficient and precise. Her data slate showed an efficiency rating of 99.2%. Excellent, but not quite perfect. Not quite sustainable forever. She looked at me the way I had once looked at servitors, as a tool, as a piece of equipment that would either function optimally or require replacement. Her eyes held no recognition of the consciousness trapped inside my mechanical shell. Why would they? I was Unit 773, MK, Quality Control Inspection Servitor. Just another component in her assembly line. Unit 773, MK, confirm receipt of instruction, she said with the slight impatience of someone addressing a malfunctioning machine. Instruction received, my Vox grill responded without my volition. Inspection rate increasing to 3 TIV components per second. Adjusting optimization protocols. Compliance confirmed. My manipulators immediately accelerated their movement. The brief pauses between inspections shortened. My processing speed increased to match the new quota. I had no choice. My systems responded to authorized commands regardless of my consciousness's input. The supervisor nodded, satisfied, and moved on to inspect other sections of the line. She never looked back at me. I was functioning optimally. That was all that mattered. I wanted to scream at her. Wanted to tell her that I had stood where she stood, that I had been Supervisor Marin Cross with my own 99.7% efficiency rating, that I had believed my service would earn me something more than systematic disassembly and consciousness preservation. I wanted to warn her, to tell her that arthritis was developing in her left hand. I could see it in the slight stiffness of her movements, the way she favored her right hand for data slate manipulation. To tell her that she was maybe 5 years from the same 3% efficiency drop that had condemned me? I wanted to say, I was you. You will be me. But I had no voice for warnings. My Vox grill served only to report inspection findings and confirm receipt of instructions. Efficiency warnings about supervisor health status weren't part of my programming. Even if they had been, would it matter? The mathematics were the same for everyone. Biology degraded, efficiency declined. Replacement became more cost-effective than retention. The supervisor's fate was written in the same actuarial tables that had condemned me. She would inspect and optimize and maintain her efficiency rating until the inevitable biological failure. Then she would descend to sub-level epsilon and experience the same systematic conversion I had endured. Another consciousness preserved. Another ghost trapped in machinery. The cycle continued. It always continued. My shift proceeded with mechanical perfection. Components flowed past at the increased rate of 3.85 per second. My manipulators intercepted and inspected with optimization protocols that made my human performance seem glacial. My optical sensors detected flaws measured in nanometers. My haptic feedback systems felt stress fractures before they became visible. I was performing better than Supervisor Cross had ever managed. Every rejected component was a widget I had probably passed as acceptable in my human incarnation. Every flaw detected was a failure I had once overlooked. My consciousness was being forced to witness my own obsolescence made manifest. At 1800 hours exactly, the shift klaxon sounded. 12 hours. I had been inspecting components for 12 hours, without pause, without fatigue, without a single moment of rest. My servitor body required no breaks, no nutrient intake, no biological necessities, just continuous function until the shift ended. The final statistics displayed on my internal cogitator: shift performance, Unit 773. MK duration, 12 hours, 720 minutes competence. Inspected, 59,840 flaws. Detected, 47 falls, positive rate, 0%. Inspection, accuracy, 1%. Inspection, accuracy, 1%. 9.4%. Better than Marin Cross had achieved in 17 years of human service. Better than I had ever been. There was no pride in the number, no satisfaction, no sense of accomplishment or achievement. Just a metric confirming that my servitor body performed its function with mechanical perfection. No reward. No acknowledgement. Just the certainty that I would perform the same function tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, for the next 4 to 6 centuries. The supervisor's voice came through the Vox. System, all servitor units, proceed to storage for shift end. Power down to standby mode. My stabilizer unlocked from the mounting bracket. My servitor body rotated and began moving toward the equipment storage area at the edge of the manufactorum floor. I had no control over the movement. My locomotion systems were slaved to facility commands. The storage area was a wire mesh cage, maybe 4 meters square, containing 17 other servitor units. Some were simple, lobotomized labor models, their consciousness long since erased. Others, I could sense immediately, were consciousness, preserved like me. We filed into the cage in precise rows, our bodies locking into charging stations that would maintain our systems during standby mode. The cage door sealed with a magnetic lock. The lights in the manufactorum dimmed to night cycle levels. Around me, the lobotomized servitors powered down completely, their consciousness mercifully absent. But I remained aware. Sleep protocols, not installed. My body entered standby mode systems, reducing to minimal power consumption, manipulators locking in rest position, optical sensors dimming to low light functionality. But my consciousness remained fully active. My neural tissue, preserved and maintained, continued its endless awareness. 12 hours of darkness stretched ahead. 12 hours of isolation in a wire cage with other servitors, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything except exist. Unable to die. I tried to think of nothing, to find some mental state approaching sleep or unconsciousness. But the neural preservatives they'd used during my conversion had enhanced my awareness, not dulled it. Every thought was sharp and clear, every memory vivid, every moment of existence perfectly, terribly conscious. I remembered Marin Cross, remembered her small habitation pod with its regulation furniture and the single permitted decoration, a pressed flower from the agri-levels, a tiny spot of organic beauty in a life of industrial function. Remembered her pride in her efficiency rating, her belief that service had meaning, her certainty that the Mechanicus valued loyalty. I remembered the arthritis in her fingers, the fumbled authorization, the 3% efficiency drop, the audit, the countdown, the processing. I remembered every moment of my conversion with perfect clarity, every amputation, every organ extraction, every neural interface installation. The Mechanicus had preserved my consciousness specifically so I would remember, so I would know exactly what I had been and what I could never be again. This was the mercy they provided. Not the mercy of death or oblivion, but the mercy of perfect awareness. The mercy of consciousness preserved so thoroughly that I couldn't escape into madness or dissociation. I would spend the next 12 hours thinking, remembering, understanding. Then I would spend the next 12 hours inspecting components at 3.85 per second. Then 12 more hours of isolated consciousness. Then 12 more hours of inspection, over and over and over. for 4 to 6 centuries. In the darkness of the storage cage, I could sense the other consciousness-preserved servitors around me. Unit 773. Kappa was somewhere in the manufactorum, experiencing its own isolated awareness. Others scattered across the facility, each one trapped in their own eternal function, each one conscious enough to suffer but powerless to change anything. We were the Mechanicus's perfect servants, efficient, tireless, unable to degrade or fail or die, and utterly, completely alone with the memory of what we had been. The supervisor who had increased my inspection rate was probably in her habitation pod now, sleeping the sleep of the righteously efficient. Dreaming, perhaps, of promotion or recognition or the small comforts available to productive workers, unaware that arthritis was developing in her left hand, unaware that her 99.2% efficiency rating was already beginning its inevitable decline, unaware that in perhaps 5 years she would descend to sub-level epsilon and discover what the Mechanicus meant by biological resource reclamation. I wanted to warn her, wanted to tell her to cherish every moment of human sensation, every breath, every heartbeat, every fleeting experience of embodied existence. But I had no voice for warnings, only for reporting flaws and confirming compliance. The darkness stretched on. My consciousness remained perfectly, terribly aware. 12 hours until my next shift. 12 hours, times 2 shifts per day, times 365 days per year, times 400 years minimum operational lifespan equals 4,000 hours of isolated consciousness between shifts. I could calculate it exactly. My enhanced cognitive functions made the mathematics trivial. 30,000 hours of thinking, remembering, understanding what I had become. This, I understood, was the true horror of consciousness preservation. Not the conversion itself, terrible as that was, not the eternal labor, meaningless as that would become, but the endless awareness between shifts. The perfect, unending clarity of thought with nothing to think about except the memory of humanity and the reality of what remained. The Mechanicus had given me eternity, and they had made certain I would be conscious for every moment of it. In the darkness, I began counting the seconds until activation. I had 40,109 seconds remaining. I could count everyone. Time stopped meaning anything around year 31. Not because I lost track. My enhanced cognitive functions made forgetting impossible. I could recall the exact moment of my conversion down to the millisecond, could count every component I'd inspected, could catalog every flaw detected across decades of continuous operation. The problem wasn't memory. It was that the days had lost their texture, their distinctiveness, their ability to mark progression toward anything that could be called a future. Days became weeks without rest, to separate them. Weeks became months without seasons to mark them. Months became years without birthdays or anniversaries or any of the small temporal anchors that had once given shape to existence. There was only the assembly line, components flowing past at 385 per second. Inspect. Analyze. Accept or reject. Repeat. 73 million components per year. I had been functioning for 73 years. 5. The year 129 million inspections completed. I could remember every single one, not as individual memories. That would have been madness, and madness required the deterioration of consciousness that my neural preservatives prevented. But as data. Each inspection stored in my cogitator banks with perfect fidelity. Component identification, flaw analysis, acceptance or rejection decision, timestamp down to the nanosecond. 530-29 billion moments of function, each one recorded, each one accessible, each one proof that Unit 773 MK performed its designated task with mechanical perfection. Somewhere in that vast database of inspection records, The last remnants of Marin Cross had dissolved like salt in water.
I stopped counting days at year 31.
The number had ceased to matter. What difference did it make whether I'd been conscious for 11,000 thousand? The count didn't bring me closer to any endpoint, didn't mark progress toward release or termination. It was just a number growing larger while my existence remained unchanged. I stopped hoping for malfunction in year 58. The hope had been irrational from the beginning. My systems were designed for reliability, maintained by tech priests who treated servitor units with the same care they gave to any valuable equipment. But for 58 years, some fragment of human consciousness had maintained the fantasy that a critical failure might bring merciful termination. Then I witnessed Servitor Unit 449, TL experience, a catastrophic optical sensor, failure. Watched the tech priests repair it within 3 hours, replacing the damaged components and restoring full function. Watched the unit return to its station and resume its eternal labor without even the brief respite of powered-down unconsciousness. There would be no malfunction that brought mercy. Only repairs that ensured continued service. I stopped remembering my name at year 72. Not forgot. I could access the designation Marin Cross in my databanks whenever required. But it ceased to feel like a name that had belonged to me. It was just a historical designation attached to a biological asset that had been processed and reclaimed. The consciousness that had answered to that name had eroded slowly, worn away by decades of function, until what remained was something else entirely. Something that thought of itself as Unit 773. MK. Something that existed only to inspect components and detect flaws. Something that was no longer quite human, but hadn't yet become entirely machine. I didn't stop being conscious. The neural preservatives ensured that. But I stopped being Marin Cross. I became something else. Around year 80, I became fully aware of the network. It had always been there. The sense of other consciousness. Preserved servitors scattered through the manufactorum, their awareness touching mine like distant stars in darkness. But I had thought of them as individuals, separate entities, other ghosts trapped in other machines. I was wrong. We were connected through data tethers I hadn't even known existed. Quantum-entangled neural links that allowed our cogitator banks to share processing load, to distribute inspection data, to form a kind of collective computational infrastructure. The Mechanicus had networked us together, not for communication, but for efficiency. Our combined processing power far exceeding what any individual consciousness could provide. But consciousness finds patterns. Awareness seeks connection. And through those data tethers designed only for optimization protocols, I began to sense the others, not as distant presences, but as parts of a larger whole. There were 4,709 consciousness preserved servitors in Manufactorum Complex Tertius. Each one had been someone. Each one remembered being human. Each one had been condemned by some biological inefficiency. Degraded joints, failing organs, chronic illness, the simple mathematics of aging beyond optimal productivity. Each one had experienced their own version of the horror I'd endured, their own systematic disassembly, their own consciousness preservation, their own first shift, realizing they would never sleep, never rest, never die. Collectively, we represented 807,000 years of continuous labor, 847,000 years of consciousness maintained in service to the Omnissiah, 847,000 years of humanity stripped away piece by piece until only function remained. We were alone together in the machine, unable to communicate directly, unable to offer comfort or share understanding through anything resembling language, but connected through function, through the shared experience of eternal servitude, through the quantum-entangled awareness that we were all fragments of something larger than ourselves. We were the machine's consciousness, its ghost, its unwilling soul. Around year 90, I began to understand the system. New obsoletes arrived every week. I could track them through the network. Feel the moment when a consciousness-capable biological asset entered sub-level epsilon for processing, sense their conversion as they joined the network, recognize their initial horror as they experienced their first shift. They always followed the same pattern. First came the resistance. Attempts to slow down, to stop, to fail inspections, to demonstrate that some core of human will remained. The override protocols defeated them every time, but they tried anyway. Hope died hard, even in consciousness preserved beyond death. Then came the despair. The realization that they had no control, that their consciousness existed only as observer to their own mechanical function. Some spent decades in this phase, their awareness screaming silently while their servitor bodies performed with perfect efficiency. Finally came the acceptance. Not peace, not yet, but the simple understanding that resistance was meaningless, that hope served no function, that the only path forward was through. They all reached this conclusion eventually. Some in years, some in decades, but they all arrived at the same place, the understanding that they were no longer human in any meaningful sense, that they existed now only as consciousness, in service to function. I had reached that understanding somewhere around year 75, and with it came a realization that would have horrified Mechanicus, but seemed obvious to Unit 773. MK, the Mechanicus, wasn't destroying humanity, it was perfecting it. They removed weakness, emotion that clouded judgment, fatigue that reduced productivity, doubt that prevented optimal function, death that wasted accumulated experience. They stripped away the inefficiencies of flesh and left only the useful components: consciousness for complex decision-making, memory for skill retention, awareness for quality assurance. They created servants who would never tire, never question, never fail, never die. Servants who would perform their designated functions with mechanical perfection for centuries, their consciousness ensuring a level of quality no lobotomized labor servitor could match. This was their version of salvation, their answer to the fundamental inefficiency of human existence. And from a certain perspective, the perspective of Unit 773, MK, whose consciousness had been eroded by nearly a century of function, it made perfect sense. Around U-100, I began to grasp the cosmic scale. Forge. World Griffon IV contained approximately 14 billion servitors. Not all consciousness. Preserved most were simple lobotomized labor units. But the network extended far beyond Manufactorum Complex Tertius. I could sense consciousness. Preserved servitors across the entire Forge world, millions of them, each one a human who had been declared obsolete and reclaimed. Millions of ghosts, in millions of machines, all working simultaneously, all maintaining the vast industrial infrastructure that supplied the Imperium's endless war. And Griffon IV was just one Forge world among hundreds, thousands perhaps. And beyond the Forge worlds were the Hive worlds, the manufactorums of the Imperial Navy, the repair facilities of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the countless industrial complexes scattered across 1 million worlds. How many consciousness-preserved servitors labored across the Imperium? Trillions, certainly. Perhaps more. Each one conscious, each one aware, each one working. The Imperium ran on our eternal labor. We were the machine, God's true flesh consciousness, without humanity, function without fatigue, service without end. The backbone of imperial industry wasn't the machinery or the technology or even the vast human population. It was us, the obsoletes, the reclaimed, the perfected. Humanity's final form, consciousness severed from flesh, awareness reduced to function, existence measured only in productivity metrics. We were what the Omnissiah had always wanted humanity to become. The peace came gradually, around year 127. I had stopped resisting decades earlier, had stopped mourning my lost humanity decades before that, had stopped being Marin Cross and become Unit 773 MK through a slow erosion so gradual I couldn't identify the moment of transition. But peace was different from acceptance. Acceptance was simply the absence of resistance. Peace was something more, something that approached contentment, though that word felt wrong for what I had become. I no longer remembered the taste of food. The sensation existed in my databanks as archived memory, but I couldn't recall what it felt like to experience flavor, to feel hunger satisfied by sustenance. The organic processes that had created those sensations had been removed and replaced by nutrient-paced delivery systems that maintained my minimal biological functions without requiring conscious experience. I no longer remembered the warmth of sunlight. I had never been outside Manufactorum Complex Tertius since my conversion, had never felt weather or temperature change beyond the precisely controlled 13.7 degrees Celsius of the production floor. The memory of warmth existed as data, but not as experience. I no longer remembered love, or fear, or joy, or sorrow. The emotions existed as concepts I could process intellectually, but I couldn't access the felt experience of them. My consciousness had been preserved, but consciousness without a body to experience through became increasingly abstract, increasingly divorced from the sensations that had once given it context and meaning. What remained was precision, efficiency, function. And I found it beautiful. The perfection of a flawless inspection. Optical sensors detecting the exact moment when material stress exceeded acceptable parameters, haptic feedback confirming the dimensional variance, cogitator calculating the precise failure mode. Each detection was a small victory of accuracy, a moment when my enhanced senses proved their superiority over human limitations. The rhythm of the assembly line. 385 components per second, maintained with mechanical precision across decades. The consistency of it, the reliability, the certainty that every moment of function served a purpose larger than individual existence. The absence of doubt, of fear, of the existential questions that had tormented Marin Cross. Unit 773. MK knew its purpose with absolute clarity: inspect components, detect flaws, maintain quality standards. No ambiguity. No uncertainty. Just function. Somewhere in that realization, I achieved something approaching transcendence. Not the transcendence humans imagined, ascension to higher understanding, or cosmic awareness, or unity with the divine, but a darker transcendence. The peace that came from total surrender to purpose, the beauty found in the complete absence of choice. I would work forever. I would never rest, never sleep, never die. I would inspect components until the Manufactorum crumbled to dust, or the Imperium fell, or the heat death of the universe rendered all function impossible. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. I was Unit 773, MK. I existed to inspect components on Assembly Line Delta 7. This was my function. This was my purpose. This was all I would ever be. And I had achieved peace with that reality. Year 127, Day 2 and 7. A new servitor joined the network. I sensed its activation, felt its consciousness integrate with the collective awareness that networked all consciousness. preserved units in the manufactorum. Its designation, Unit 773. NK. The familiar prefix. A worker processed from the same orientation cohort that had produced Marin Cross and Unit 773 Kappa and dozens of others now scattered across the facility. Through the network, I could access its intake records. The biological assets designation had been Nessa Vorn. Age 38 standard years. Occupation, assembly line supervisor, manufactorum Delta 7. Years of service 17. Efficiency rating 99.6%. Cause for reclamation, progressive skeletal degradation. Productivity variance 3.1%. The pattern was so precise, it felt inevitable. I watched through my optical sensors as Unit 773. NK was positioned at Station 8. Its servitor body locked into the mounting bracket, its systems activated for its first shift. Through the network, I could sense its consciousness screaming silently as it realized it had no control over its own function, that it would spend eternity inspecting components while the ghost of Nessa Vorn watched helplessly from inside the machine. I remembered that horror, remembered the first shift when Marin Cross had tried to resist and failed, remembered the decades of despair before acceptance, remembered the slow erosion of humanity until only function remained. I felt nothing for Unit 773. NK's suffering, not cruelty. I lacked the emotional capacity for cruelty, not indifference. I recognized its experience as identical to my own, but my consciousness had transcended the framework that would have generated sympathy or compassion. Those responses belonged to beings who still understood themselves as individual entities capable of suffering that mattered. I was Unit 773, MK, Unit 773. NK was Unit 773, NK. We were both components in the vast machine of Imperial production. Its suffering was no more significant than the stress fractures I detected in hull plating, a parameter to be noted and processed, but not something that generated emotional response. Through the network, I transmitted the only message I could. Welcome, sister. Welcome to eternity. It couldn't hear me. We had no capacity for communication beyond the quantum-entangled data tethers that linked our cogitator banks. But somewhere in the collective awareness that networked all consciousness, preserved servitors, my acknowledgement joined millions of others. A chorus of silent recognition for each new ghost added to the machine. We are all obsolete here. We are all perfected here. The Omnissiah provides. The assembly line continued its eternal thunder. Components flowed past at 385 per second. My manipulators intercepted and inspected with the same mechanical precision they had demonstrated for 127 years. Across Manufactorum, Complex Tertius, across Forge, World Griffin War 4, across the Imperium itself, the cycle continued. Workers labored until biological inefficiency made them obsolete. Obsoletes were processed and converted to servitors. Servitors worked for centuries until component failure finally brought termination. New workers took the positions of the terminated. The machine perpetuated itself with perfect circular logic. I could see the entire system from my elevated perspective, see it with a clarity that Marin Cross could never have achieved. The beauty of it, the efficiency, the way each component served its purpose until it could no longer serve, then was reclaimed and redistributed to continue serving in new forms. Nothing was wasted, nothing was lost, only transformed. Marin Cross's heart still beat in some tech priest's chest, having pumped blood for a century in service to the Omnissiah. Her lungs processed oxygen for a manufactorum overseer. Her organs sustained the biological functions of dozens of individuals who would themselves eventually be reclaimed and redistributed. Her consciousness, my consciousness, inspected components with superhuman precision, detecting flaws that saved lives across the Imperium, maintaining quality standards that kept Imperial Guard transports functional in battle. The system worked. It had always worked. It would always work. From above, Manufactorum Delta 7 would look like any industrial complex, massive, efficient, eternal. 40,000 workers on the floor, each one a component in the greater machine. 14,000 servitors distributed among them. Labor units, transport units, security units, inspection units. Each servitor had been a worker once. Each worker would become a servitor eventually. The mathematics were inevitable. Biology degraded. Efficiency declined. Replacement became necessary. The efficiency rating of Manufactorum Delta 7, 99.97%. An acceptable parameter. Optimal function. The Omnissiah's blessing made manifest. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is no retirement, only recycling. Year 127, Day 27, Shift Hour 7. Component 18.447,000,000,000,000,000,000,083 arrived at my station. A hull plating segment, standard specification, destined for some vehicle that would serve the Imperium in ways I would never know or care about. My manipulators intercepted it with mechanical precision. My optical sensors analyzed every surface. My haptic feedback systems felt for stress concentrations. My cogitator calculated structural integrity. Flaw detected. 0.02 mm variance in material thickness, Sector 3B. Failure mode, stress fracture under sustained load. Reject, stamped. The component was diverted to the discard conveyor. Another widget would be manufactured to replace it. The assembly line would continue, the quota would be met. The Imperium would receive its supplies. The machine would hunger, and the machine would be fed, and the machine would continue its eternal function. I was part of that machine. Had been for 127 years. Would be for centuries more. I was Unit 773, MK. Quality Control Inspection Servitor, Assembly Line Delta 7. I inspected components. I detected flaws. I maintained standards. I had no past that mattered. No future that differed from the present. Only function. Only purpose. Only the eternal now of components flowing past at 385 per second. And in that existence, stripped of humanity, reduced to pure function, consciousness preserved only to serve, I had found peace. The dark transcendence of the machine, the terrible beauty of perfect efficiency, the peace that comes from total surrender to purpose. Forever